Well, thank you for two marvelous talks, for presenting the most curmudgeonly theorist that ever existed in a compelling way. That is a huge talent. And I want to ask you about nihilism just to start. I'm going to ask you two questions, and then I guess you'll ask some questions, Katie, and we'll go on from there. And I think we'll have time at a certain point to open it up.
Oh, yeah.
So we'll see how that happens. So about nihilism, which you said should be thought with Weber as a condition, not an attitude. It seems to me nihilism has two possible vectors now. One is the anti-foundationalist vector that you talked about, where in a sense if you say, if we recognize that we're coming from nowhere, values become plastic, we can debate them, we can have an agon in the public sphere about them. We can even create values, especially if you know that there are no fixed or eternal values. But the second vector, I think, of nihilism is apocalypticism, which comes up in your rhetoric. And that would be the nihilism of going nowhere. What the anti-foundationalist move was always to open up the future and de-determine the future. Now we're in a situation in which we're struggling over how determined our future is now. But if it is fully determined, or close to fully determined, I'm not sure that the anti-foundationalist pose serves for this. That's my question. In anti-foundationalism, you can use nihilism because without a foundation, the future is undetermined. It brings a kind of want of world, as you called it, to the center. But in apocalypticism, where instrumental reason hits this wall, the wall it created, I'm not sure that that is value creating. So that's my question. What do you do with apocalypticism in this moment if you're turning to nihilism to help us through? All right, that's one question. And the second question is why values? This is a question really for you in your broader thinking.
Yeah.
Is that what you were going to ask?
No, but
You're
I just am delighted that you're asking it. Yes.
Okay. And I
I
think
have to make you pause for a second.
Okay.
I made my classic move of bringing two pens so that when one ran out of ink, the other one would serve, and they both apocalyptically collapsed on me. Thank you.
So why values?
Yeah.
I know Weber is emphasizing values, and you're experimenting with him.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't mean to pin you to that. But there are other possibilities, like concept creation, right? In a sense, if you're going to affirm something, someone has to say what it is you're affirming. That would be like a Deleuzian response. We can create new concepts, and then people can affirm them. But that's what you do in the university, not adjudicate values or deconstruct them. The other would be just the old standard utopias, right? Instead of values, you kind of imagine a way the whole world would be with all of the problems that attend on that. That's just what came to mind. But value associated with mystery and the ineffable and the irrational makes me ask that question. Why values and not something else? Those are my two kind of big questions.
I'll name my two questions briefly, and then we'll riff a bit. The two questions are, why does Wendy Brown turn to Max Weber? Does Wendy Brown need Max Weber? And here I'm speaking Wendy Brown as a character, a figure, I wager an icon. Why talk with Max Weber? And two, what do we, and here I want the room to join into, the incredible Q&A last night, which concluded with a, to me, thrilling moment about the nature of teaching in the modern university and whether our pursuit of expertise collaborates with the production of the right kinds of classrooms and curricula. And so the way I would put that question in a bald form would, throughout your talks, the vocational is a problem. My colleague Michael Denning raised, I thought, thoughtfully a question that was on my mind of, is vocational a problem? You replied thoughtfully about the nature of being at other institutions where the aggression of the vocational was much louder in curricular reform. So, one, why does Wendy Brown need to speak to Max Weber? So, There's, to me, no doubt in my mind that the return to classical texts is a thing that we, who's the we? Is it this room? Is it this building? The people who made this building? Is it legislators? Return to classical texts. Why? They never tire of the return. They are renewable. In their renewability, we teach ourselves how to think. So, the easy answer, Wendy Brown speaks to Max Weber because she refuses a culture of canceling and says, I find something in Max that helps me, Wendy, articulate louder something that had always been in my thought. But do we also then participate in a reiteration of certain forms of weakness that Wendy Brown does not possess? And insofar as I, and I think many in this room are working, not merely to clean up the mistakes of our fathers, but also to forge new territories further, which your work, both talks, allow us to do. I do sometimes wonder, especially in the midst of the deep critique of Weber, and as you walked out of it, now, Wendy, to Katie, I thought, she doesn't need him. Her both talks could have functioned entirely from her own voice, her own story, her own materials. And indeed, if anything, at times, I thought, he brings her to a level that is not hers. So, vocational. I'm, my primary identity is as Americanist. That's a dangerous imperial term. We have institutions of higher education in this country for two reasons. One is Christianity, and the other is a claim to vocation. So the story that we tell about liberal arts is a very important and powerful story, but it is one resuscitated from dirtier origins. So until, as we well know on this stage, but I think we all, until the Civil War, there were no non-Christian institutions of higher education in this country. The emergence of the so-called land-grant institution was a plot to territorialize the West, overtly in the Moral Act, to create education for agriculture, engineering, science, and teachers. So training teachers and training agricultural thinking, that is the work of settler colonials, both hands, was essential to the formation of the land-grant public university. The story of liberal arts emerges from that, since there's a great little clause in the Moral Act that says, not to the detriment, of course, of classical, they didn't say of course, of classical education. So the Moral Act still wanted to protect classical education, yet the only institutions of higher education that existed before 1850 that cared deeply, practiced deeply classical education are the University of South Carolina, the University of Georgia, University of North Carolina. Everyone here knows these were also practices of trying to legitimate white supremacy through the forms of classical means. So we arrive now, all of us at the 21st century, me, a defender of the liberal arts, but what's the history of that liberal arts that we value? I would argue it's a history 1972 to 1998. We have to get past the Civil Rights Act. We have to get past Title IX. We have to get to a place where actually those institutions are genuinely fighting to be democratic, and the myth we have of a post-war land-grant institution filled with people studying non-vocational things is, I think, strongly and powerfully a myth. So there is, though, a powerful 20-year history of land-grant institutions being the sources of, as you powerfully put, creativity, vitality, and critique. But I wonder sometimes if the history that we have for the non-vocational is limited. It's a boomer story, and we would do well to think about how, as you put powerfully in your answer to Q&A, what is the curriculum for democracy, rather than a curriculum that is, and this is not your language, but I worry about it being in circulation, against vocation, since I think vocation is deep in the financial and institutional waters that we swim.
Don't you want to just keep listening to her? We'll try to make that happen. First, thank you both. It's an enormous honor and pleasure to be working with these two. I think we really are going to have a conversation. So let me start with Paul's. Division of nihilism into its post-foundationalist possibilities and promise, the openings, versus apocalypticism, and take a step back from those choices and say something else. It seems to me that what Weber, leaning on Nietzsche, means by thinking nihilism as a condition is that it's a peculiarly Western historical predicament that comes from having founded truth, authority, order, and everything else in monotheism. And that it is not that as soon as anybody stops having religious authority or other kinds of authorities understood to be above history, outside the human world, as Nietzsche puts it, that everything wobbles in the way that Nietzsche describes. His story is a story of, I'm going to say Judeo-Christian, though I don't usually use the term, because he takes so seriously that Christianity comes out of Judaism. So it's a particular story about the predicaments of meaning once monotheistic authority crashes, and a particular story about the conceits of science in that displacement. So I am not convinced that the so-called post-foundationalist retort to this problem, that's a little strong, response to this problem, which is, okay, now we know we make meaning, we even make the meaning of meaning, and so now we just, the political solution is to just do it right, really gets at the depth and the problematic that the collapse of a particular source of meaning and its continued devastation by the conceits of science. All you can know is what's true about the world. You can't know how to value or rank value. Even with climate change science, you have to decide if you want a world. You have to decide if you prefer to have a future over contemporary continued ways of life. And I don't think that's just about the real creeps and fossil fuels industry. I think we're all deciding that every day. I think that's part of how we live the predicament of something like knowledge about a climate emergency. It's like, well, I really want that vacation. I know I'm not supposed to fly, but my family's been dreaming of going to the Himalayas forever, and we're just going to do it, and then we'll think about this other problem later. And I actually think that the whole predicament of the relationship to the truth of facticity that Weber gives us, and the problematic of value, that usurpation of value by the rise of facticity without the ability to establish or rank value, is, in his mind, because in Nietzsche's mind, because he relies so heavily on Nietzsche, a distinctly Western predicament and a distinctly late modern Western predicament. Now that said, I do think that today, that I just will add, that's why I think Nietzsche and then Weber spend so much time on the question of what happens to value, that it doesn't just disappear, it grows, trivial or instrumental or branded or fungible or tradable, trafficable, rather than just vanishing, and that too is peculiar to that history. That said, I do think that the possibility that, and this is beginning to answer both of your questions about why Weber, that Weber offers is one parallel to the Habermasian one. Okay, now we have to figure out what to value, but that Weber really places it in a more political, distinctly political frame, by saying that is where we will settle value. It's not that it's going to be settled in the classroom or the philosopher's study or in deliberation or in consensus or anything else. It's really going to be about putting value out there and making it attractive, and that's why it gets attached scarily to charisma. And at the same time, that's where we will foreground that struggle. I find that part of Weber's thinking really worth thinking with on the left. I think we have allowed that formulation to be scarily framed as Hitlerian, Mussolini-ish, but also the project that you see in our current Attorney General that was confessed openly a week and a half ago, that what the real task of the US now is to simply restore Christian values to legislation, adjudication, and all of culture. But I don't think it's just it belongs with the right. And I think that the left has a tendency to believe that rationality or institutions or proceduralism or simply the rule of law is what will rescue us, or simply reckoning with facts. And I think, to begin to answer the why Weber question, I think he's telling us over and over again, no, that's not how politics works, but that's not also where we are at the point at which we cannot root value in those things. That's the world that will continue to be important at a so-called scientific level, but it's not the place where we will decide who we are, how do we live, what do we value, what's our relationship to one another, to the earth, and to the things we think we need as a collectivity, as it were. Now, that said, there is this, I'm going to move off of question one soon, or I will not leave any room for anything else. There is this problem of apocalypticism, and I do think that for many, that's the piece of the nihilistic condition, combined with the fact that we actually seem to be staring into a very immediate potential for total darkness. That is the piece of the nihilistic predicament that many have either in their hearts or are driven by. And I alluded to that in some of the kind of will to nothingness that I think we see in some of the right. I concluded my last book with the argument that there's a certain part of wounded white male supremacy that simply says, you know, if we don't rule the planet, there will be no planet. If we don't rule democracy, there will be no democracy. I do think that we see that current and that surge in the present, and I think that needs to be sort of taken on board and dealt with. And I do think that apocalypticism, it hangs out in hearts that are not necessarily right-wing as well. Mm-hmm. I don't think it's an inevitable entailment of the nihilistic predicament simply because it can be broken off from the question of whether we have certain predicaments of meaning today that require us to make decisions and engage in struggles for what we value, what we love, what we decide to affirm. There's much more to say about that. I think we could have hours on this topic, but I'll leave it there. On the question of why values, yeah, Weber did lead me down a path here because I don't really believe in the histories. Let me put it this way. One of Weber's big fights, as most people know, is with a Marxist materialism, and there's a much more materialist strain in my thinking than Weber would tolerate, and a much more Foucauldian strain in my thinking than Weber would tolerate. Neither of them would have any use for this idea of values. But what do I think Weber has rescued here? The idea that there is always some value, even if it's a terribly depleted, weak and anemic value in the machineries that dominate us. They're not just ideological, that is, for example, capitalism, neoliberalism, forms of moral traditionalism that govern today. They're not just ideological, they're actually Weber's the one who gives us the concept of political rationality that Foucault then makes so much of. There's forms of value in organized operations of rationality by which we live today, and the only way to contest those is with counter-values. So I can't go all the way with Weber on values, but I think he's onto something that disappears from both the Marxist and Foucauldian approaches to history and power and what governs us that I would otherwise use. They do not have to be associated with mystery, ineffability, theology, and so forth. Though I think what Weber is reminding us is they will always have, when they're powerful, some either reactive or erotic or other attachment that is not reducible to rational deliberation. So this is my pushing away from the Habermasian attempt to give us new normative orders. Now, why Max Weber? So last night at dinner, I confessed that, it won't be a very exciting confession, that had I not fallen in love with political theory at a very young age, probably my own political passions would be much less circuitous and mediated through canonical political writers and studies of texts, and probably just be more ways of reading the contemporary world and arguing for what was wrong with it and declaring what we need to do. And in some ways, I'm often aware of this when I'm teaching. I realize that I'm forcing students through the same path, often without the same ardor for the canon, that I took in order to arrive at something like, well, that liberty takes this form, but it also takes this form. And look, if you think over here with Marx, you realize that emancipation is really different from what Mill means by liberty, and that looks over there like just an individual thing where you're just navigating the conditions of life. And Marx says here, we really need to seize those conditions and shape them ourselves, and that's where freedom rests. And to do that, we struggle with on the Jewish question, and we struggle with Mill's subjection of women, and we go through all of this difficulty, and we could just cut through it. So, what do we do with this fact that we scholars, many of us, were drawn to the fields, the texts, the study that we do for reasons that we might call aesthetic, erotic, intellectual, and we have political motivations and animations, that we attach to that, and we try to do it responsibly, so we're not simply becoming textual dogmatists or pedagogical dogmatists, but it's kind of a circuitous and maybe needlessly layered route, and particularly with somebody like Weber. So I think that's true. I think that is like a little bit of the madness of what we do, and maybe even, if we're going to be really rough on ourselves, maybe even the wastefulness of what we do. However, what I have gotten from teaching Weber and encountering Weber year after year is an encounter with a deeply conservative thinker whom I also admire. And what I have also gotten from thinking with Weber is an encounter with somebody who has as much passion for knowledge and as much passion for politics and the redemption of the political realm as any other thinker or human I know. This is how one ends up with one's dead interlocutors. I know him. And I feel like my thinking is sharpened and cultivated and cultured at that site. Because of the encounter with the conservatism, I have to really think through, what do I want to value and affirm and cherish of that? What do I want to lean away from? What do I want to build from? How do I want to modify it? And also, I have to really think through that knowledge-politics relation. I think many of us are often at some kind of odds with our super PC colleagues or students, our conservative colleagues or students. We're trying to keep alive a kind of intellectual openness, curiosity, availability to the novel, to the new, avoid having political programs and dicta dominate what we do or how we think, but at the same time trying to honor that there is no neutral knowledge, that you can't read the moral act as simply having brought us the... I won't do all of that again, you did it beautifully. So that's where Weber really helps me. That, it's like where Rousseau helps me not be the kind of Marxist that I was in my youth, where I really thought it was that materialism in an expansive economic sense that included reproductive and productive life and all the rest of it was what mattered. And then I encounter a thinker like Rousseau, and I think, no, there's also this other really important realm for freedom and collective self-determination. It's a political realm. It's not subsumable to the material, to the economic. It is the place where we have to think out sovereignty, self-determination, but also the question of difference, what we do when we disagree. And again, I'm going to end where I started. Probably I could do it some other way. I don't think I'd do it as well. Now then the question is, does that matter? Is this just a scholar's satisfaction? Oh, I've really gotten all the subtleties onto the page, but it hasn't really helped the world much.
What's the politics of that?
What's the politics of that? So sometimes I haven't done it yet, but I've thought about trying to teach classes that aren't political theory at all. Like, how do we reconcile democracy and climate change? Which I think is a really hard problem. How do we deal with the fact that democracy is probably not the domain that will give us a second chance at this planet? It's going to have to happen from supervenient powers. By supervenient, I don't mean godly. I mean something above democratic deliberation and elections and so forth. And it's going to happen in some hardcore enforceable way. And that's just a preliminary thought. And I've thought about trying to just teach classes, a class where I just try to have students and me think through that problem without doing it through all these kinds of mediations. It's a little scary for me.
Right.
It's because it's a little bit, these are our apertures. These are our security blankets. But that tells me that probably we ought to try. And
Well, it seems that was what I heard,
Yeah.
the conclusion of yesterday.
Yes.
How are our apertures keeping us from fulfilling a democratic purpose for these institutions? But I want to get into that before I do. Do you want to say anything about apocalypticism, my brother?
No, I'd like to say something about old texts
Please.
and old
Please
men,
do.
since it's the only thing I ever do. So I'm like the extreme version of one side of you. What I hear you, so I always gather from you this great motivation for going back to the Webers and the Platos and the Machiavellis. Because in some sense, the world, especially in its mediatic form, it narrows you to a set of arguments that seem immovable. And someone might come up with another position, but it's always kind of dialectical vis-a-vis those positions. Left, right. But once a text has been canceled and become recondite, and it's clearly not of our age, it becomes a source for things that we wouldn't have thought of. Because the texts, as you've shown with Weber so brilliantly, are much bigger than our caricatures of them that we use to bolster our opinions. So I see you discovering nobody wants to go back and become a Weberian. There are people who are Weberians, and we don't invite them to give Tanner lectures usually. But that's not what you're doing. You're finding to quote Heidegger, the parts of the past that were unthought, even in Weber, and that speak to us from afar. And you do that consistently in all of your books. You bring these messages from afar out of their context, and they wake you up. So that's my spirited defense of what you do. Does that sound
That said,
familiar?
let me now make a polemical point and probably offend one person in this room. What has happened in my field to the history of political thought with the adamant Cambridge School and its cousins style of historicism, that what we are doing in the history of political thought is trying to get the context right so that we get the meaning right, so that we really understand what's going on there, has nearly destroyed the kind of thing that I am trying to do with political theory, and that many of those initially drawn to political theory want to do to it. I think literature has more polyvocality in its approaches. That at least looks that way to me from where I sit. But the conquest has been nearly complete in that field, and people who do the kind of thinking I do are supposed to just be doing so-called contemporary political theory, or what is usually called normative political theory, without this kind of what one of my colleagues referred to as amateurish mining of the canonical text. Amateurish because why? Because I didn't master the Weber literature, because I don't know all the German history, because I'm not doing all the work in the original language, because I am not simply reconciling one piece of Weber's thought with another, but bringing all kinds of contemporary concerns to it, and taking what I want and leaving the rest. And so when I was arguing yesterday for breaking out of these silos, that's some of the kind of silo that I'm insisting on breaking out of.
Yeah.
But long live the amateur.
Well, it's a tricky thing to
for,
say, right?
No?
Because we're looking at graduate
the educated
students.
citizen, the amateur.
Yeah.
Well, this is, I think, but this is the challenge of the politics of these institutions, which of course I'm especially interested in that challenge. Are these institutions the site for future thinking for democracy, or are they not? So in what role do these institutions play? Since I think
so important a question.
The mesmerization of expertise, we have to admit, is throttling all of us, such that my guess is most of the people in this room are not here because of Wendy Brown, political theorists only known by political science departments, but because they precisely saw you as insurgent on those terms, as amateur on those terms, so that they could access the work. And when you say, I got from Weber, that's not how politics work, and that there's values, even if they're terribly weak and anemic, in all machinery. I got that from Wendy Brown. I've read all of Weber. I didn't get that from Weber. I got that from Wendy Brown. So to the extent that the discovery in a text is usually a mirror image of self, you find the thing that resonates and then you create brotherhood. There's no doubt that's the dream of the college seminar, that we would teach great works and that briefly the students, we would subordinate our crazy daily selves and realize in the wisdom of the text, Plato, Kant, Toni Morrison, the enormity of other souls. That is a beautiful model. I think there's probably large consensus that's a model to fight for. Is that happening in these institutions where the expertise it takes to get into that room is canceling the capacity to truly create a free room?
And let me add that the criteria for excellence, which means appointments, tenure, promotion, and the rest, are precisely criteria that reject the amateurishness. Precisely those criteria.
So then
that's why I'm trying to address the graduate students
It's
in the
ironic.
room. They know that. They know they can't do what I did. They cannot give the lecture I gave and expect to get a job.
So that we all seem as hypocrites. And then, as you say, you face a classroom that's asking, why should I subordinate to these texts? When to be able to do this is both asking me to silence such large parts of myself, and in the end, what will I get for that self-subordination?
Yeah, and it's not speaking to the world.
Right.
Which is the thing that we think we want to do. It's the thing Weber prohibited, but that's where he's also helpful for me. I mean, I'm thinking about, okay, that prohibition is really deep. He won. That prohibition that you work on, you are a scholar's scholar. I mean, the prohibition against, engaging world, mixing in your own aspirations and fears and reactions into your scholarship and thinking through a text with the kind of admixture of all of that in order to bring something to the world, in order to bring something to students. So we are educating for democracy. That's what he prohibited, and that prohibition is so deep in the academy. It is so deep. So part of what I was arguing for at the very end was to struggle against that. And I know it's not easy because, interestingly enough, even among the three of us up here, we still have our little noses in the air when it comes to our judgment of scholarship. And it's not, it's, we're still looking for, does this person really know her Kafka? Or is she just making shit up? And
Oh, wait a minute.
Okay.
That shit is all made up.
Okay. I want to say just one more thing. I have just a tiny quarrel with you about the Moral Act. You know it better than I do. I want to just argue about your dating for a second, which is you said, the only real moment we get this high-quality mass public higher education is 1972 until neoliberalism kills it. I feel like you're forgetting the post-war period.
I have strong feelings about that period. Let's get into it, Wendy Brown. Let's do it.
Okay.
You want to go at that fantasy, the GI comes home? Yeah, I mean, it's a very particular moment, and why I want the Civil Rights Act to come in is who were in those rooms.
I understand that.
So insofar as freedom, for me, I don't deny that there is a great deal of nostalgia for a particular experience, but I'm interested in the challenge of that when the room is genuinely reaching for true democracy, which it really wasn't from 45 to 72, in my strong demographic intellectual opinion.
Yeah.
But I don't deny that many people in this room were taught in those classrooms, have a memory of them. And I just want to remind them, as I know you do in your work, who was there, what capacity was there to feel differently about Kafka, what kind of questions were being raised about Kafka, insofar as he was even in the curriculum at that point.
They were all engineers in that period anyway.
And also then the vocational was not disconnected from the GI Bill. And so insofar as the deepest claim I want to make is something about, can the vocational be aligned with democracy? More than I think absolutely, as citizen forever of the state of Wisconsin, the heart of the question of the end of the but at the same time, those institutions were all teachers' colleges and agricultural colleges, and it was seen that to be a teacher, to be an engineer, was also tied up with democracy. What are the right curriculum for that? Is Weber the right curriculum for that in 2019, 2039? I think I want to align the interests of course, the worker, the vocational, alongside the praise of democracy and democracy.
That really ties in with another of my questions on my list, which is, what is Wendy Brown's university? What is the curriculum? The Brown University. The new Brown University. I know that's really an unfair question, but.
Well, it's interesting. It's not an entirely unfair question. When, in the late 90s, the University of California saw this huge population bulge coming and also understood that it would be majority non-white, and before the crash of the 2000s, the recession followed by the financial crisis, a new campus was to be founded, and it was the University of California at Merced, which most of you haven't heard of. And it's in the Central Valley. It's in a relatively poor part of the Central Valley. It's in a part of the Central Valley that once was our agricultural heartland and also an industrial heartland. Most of the industries were so heavily polluting that they've been moved over the border into Mexico. And agriculture lives on, but in a different way. And it's now the meth capital of California. So that's where the new university was being dropped, and a shadow senate was formed, a faculty senate, because it didn't have faculty yet when it was going to be built. And I was lucky enough to be a representative on that senate. There were 10 of us, and our task was to design a new university. And we had fantastic ideas. We were going to combine educating for democracy with educating populations, most of whom were first generation. And many of whom would be from migrant families, but most of whom, even if they weren't, even if they were white working class, hadn't been to college before, with the understanding that this university campus was going to be treated by the system of UC as the stepchild. We knew it. We knew it from the beginning. We could smell it. We could see it. We knew all the reasons that was going to be the case. It wasn't even going to have a library. It was going to use interlibrary loans so that Berkeley and Davis and UCLA would be. But we still thought we could do something exciting. We were going to do it by building clusters of knowledge and teaching that represented disciplines so that people could still get tenure in their discipline, but were not exclusively disciplinary. And we also understood that problems would shift, would change, and that vocations would shift and change. So we built in a light kind of fluidity. I won't go further, but I will say that our beautiful architecture of this new college at the level of intellect was eliminated by the first president in favor of the most vocational in the classic sense University of California campus, where teaching and a teaching school, not even called an education school, is important, as is engineering, but as is also a series of things that have to do with the construction trades and other things. It's pretty much a 4-year community college. And we were told explicitly, as we were designing this thing, Latinos don't want to learn Shakespeare. We were told explicitly that building in literature and poetry and critical theory and all kinds of other things, and also building programs that would allow for the possibility of explicitly political development, that was one of our constellations, was just silly. What was going to be wanted by this student population were practical vocations and an education that would produce it. So all I'm doing is ending on a more critical note. But I don't have, this is not something one person figures out. And I think what we're also expressing up here is a ton of ambivalence. We all love our fields. No, we don't love our disciplines. We all love the things that drew us into them. And we also all know that that might not be quite right for this moment, but we also don't want to become sort of flat-footedly urgent about the moment in such a way that we think, oh, what we must do is solve problems and teach civics and the value of a constitution and why democracy really matters and what it really involves and what inclusion really involves, and forget all the rest of that stuff. Because we know to do that well, to be those kinds of citizens, you also need to be a historically minded person. You need to understand this present isn't the only present, and this present has historical determinants. To teach that, you can't just say it. You have to steep students in it. So that's where we're, I think, deeply ambivalent. Should we go here?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, we should.
I know that was sudden, but
No, we should.
we
Let's do it. I, of course, as we're getting the microphones, I want people to come forward and speak. I think about who produced that president of UC Merced. There's the demographics about university leadership still are, with important incursions by schools of business, are still predominantly PhD'd people. So insofar as these institutions have a concept of variable faculty leadership, variable, to what extent do we incorporate as a part of our self-making ideas of these sorts of conversations? Since I'm interested that I've no doubt there are many political forces that influence the transformation of your utopia into reality. But I could imagine multiple different kinds of persona occupying that role who would have taken different.
You want us to just keep talking? No, okay.
Just one thing that was so amazing, one of the purposes of going back to Weber or any of the others is just to make people want to read it. And I always feel like the stuff I read is like, they just don't want to make me read it. You made me go back and read the Weber quickly in the last couple of days. And two thoughts have come out of this conversation in that. One is...
Maybe get the microphone just a little closer to your tall self.
Okay.
There you go.
One thing that comes out is that those last comments about Merced were, to my mind, closer to much of what Weber was doing in Science and Vocation than lots of the rest of it. Because he actually is talking about the state of the university. There's a fascinating account of the difference between the American university and the German university. And that question of kind of what is the nature of a university with not just the theoretical and abstract issues, but the vital issues. He even talks about salaries of assistant professors in that essay. That made that I was so glad that you gave us that account of the Merced thing. But it doesn't. So that goes back, I think, to the question I asked a little bit yesterday, which is whether one could imagine a more positive sense of a vocational education. If indeed there is a more powerful sense, perhaps it is my apostate Catholicism and my apostate communism that thinks that liberal arts education isn't the end of an educational imagination, but education for real callings, for the dignity of different callings, for crafts that would include the vocation of being a musician, the vocation of being a caregiver, that could break the SAT monopoly of the vision of liberal education. Yeah. So that's one thought. Second thought, be very quick. The other thing that he starts with, I was struck by, you ended with last night, is actually the tension between scholar and teacher.
Yes.
That these are not the same
Yes.
thing, and there really is. And I just wondered, it seemed to me that the question of the relation of politics is different for scholars than for teachers.
Yes.
Very powerfully, I agree entirely with his idea that we should not be political people in the lecture room, as
Yes.
the translation that I read is, that we are not we are not leaders, we are teachers, and
Yes.
that's a different thing. The question of whether or not values, politics, all of those things have a place in scholarship is a different kind of question, I think, than in teaching. One that he's doesn't answer for me, and I wondered if you had thoughts on that.
For him, real scholarship also cannot have values, politics in it, because the study of the facts comes to an end. That said, what's striking about his corpus is how many so-called occasional papers, not to mention political papers, comprise that corpus. He's eager to set out his views on all kinds of things as long as they're demarcated, the way they are in the vocations lectures themselves, as values projects rather than as scholarly projects. But here I would join you in saying that one could honor Weber's own understanding of why it's inappropriate for us to polemicize in the classroom or even push in a either overt or covert way our own political values or other values without identifying them as such. If we say we can't strip them out, we know that, we know better than that everything's an interpretation, blah, 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 that even then it needs to be identified as such. But I think one could see Weber as making that argument largely because of what he calls the inegalitarianism of the classroom. We sit here, the students sit there, we speak, they're mute. I know that's supposedly less the case in seminars, but we still know what the power relations are, and he did too. Whereas in one's writing, one is writing, making an argument, and others can encounter it by arguing back. So it's a very different order of things, a very different relationship to the problem of power in our writing, leaving aside the question of in our research, in our writing, than in our teaching. So I think one could make that distinction. That said, I find it interesting that most of us in this room, I suspect, have more respect for academic work in the humanities, and let's just call it the human sciences, interpretive social sciences and the humanities and arts, more respect for work that really tries to grapple with its object than work that precedes the object with its view, its value, its polemic, and so forth. We know what we have to say about that kind of stuff. We don't like it. We tell our students not to do it. We discount it when we're doing evaluations of other people's research and so forth. We don't like it when people lead with their values. We like it when they work things out through the object that they're analyzing, even if we bring certain questions and certain prejudices and certain interests and certain animating purposes to the work. So I still think there's some interval. That's why I tried to get rid of the opposition, but some interval that most of us are somewhat interested in, that I think we're probably also interested in democratic debate. We want people to think about the problem before them and learn from it, not simply come charging in with what they're quite sure of.
How do you conceive of your relationship between, I guess, knowledge production and power? And do you think that sort of off that a revolution or sort of like radical action can really even be incited from within the institution itself? And is that a part of your scholarly project? Is that something you guys care about?
I think that's also what you're asking. And thank you for that question. I mean, you put it in a very compressed way, and as usual, we elaborated in all kinds of big ways. I think the simple answer that to your question is no, this is not. There's too much vested interest in our positions, security, ways, habits, institutional attachments, lovely modes of life, to imagine that this is the source of such things. That said, I've never been opposed to the idea of split personalities as long as they're not really injurious and dangerous to the psyche. Forget that sentence. What I mean is, I think it's one thing for us to know that and acknowledge that, and another thing to have as our purpose in the classroom, to open up this world and allow it to be a place for students to be incited by what they learn and desire from that place a different world. That said, what some of my undergraduates resist in my own pedagogy, because they know I'm on the left, and then I'm always saying, wait, we're not making revolution here, we're trying to figure things out. This is where we figure things out. And they say, but let's cancel class and go do blah, blah, blah. And because we're always having strikes at Berkeley for this and that. And it's like, cancel class? You don't understand. There are like 15 seconds left to a liberal arts education. Don't cancel this thing. This is the last place you have to actually sit and think and learn and deliberate and expand what you know and believe and think the trajectory of the world could be, might be, and so forth. This is where we do that. There's tons of room beyond this hour and a half twice a week to act. This should not be our organizing site. So, you're seeing the split personality. I want them to be doing that, and I participate in it myself. And at the same time, I think that the place for thinking and mulling and deliberating and reflecting and criticizing and rethinking what one knows and learning new stuff and changing one's angle of vision, that's at best what universities can be for, and that we mustn't join the rush on the part of the right to eliminate that space by being complicit with it in our own political urgency.
I feel like a graduate student in your class, so I'm going to propose this and you can tell me what you think about it. Speaking to your issue, and especially to your friend who I know has a similar concern, I want to propose a case. Thinking back to the GI Bill and the university there and the role of a classical education or reading old texts there, I think it's very different at this moment than it was then. And the case I want to propose to you, but I don't think we're there yet. I think even this very debate, where thinking belongs to the academy and acting belongs to, is part of the fact that we're not sufficiently neoliberalized in the university enough, hear me out, for the classical text to be such a huge political act that it is the point of resistance. And the case I'm thinking of is Chile, which I now know a lot about. During the dictatorship, which was the neoliberalization of the country, they just blew out all the classical education in the universities, and it all became vocational, and it was all, every ounce of it was set up to build a kind of a score, a kind of a credit to give you a leg up in this giant market, including the real estate value of the land on which the university was. But some people got together and founded an underground university in which they read these texts. And it was open to anybody, and the people who came were resisting not through learning to think critically, but even knowing that there was a position outside, number one. And texts, they were teaching only critical texts, in which all of these questions were up for grabs. In a sense, Weber's a little bit different than that, because it's the way he speaks, at least in these lectures, is so authoritative.
Yeah.
You think there's no problems with it.
Yeah.
It's like this, it's like this, it's like this. But for the most part, he's contending with severe problems. Just the idea that you could, by talking, by thinking, contend with problems in an age like that is huge. But we're not there yet. We still think we could, that tradition in its traditional way, some people think this, could carry us forward. Or throwing it out could carry us forward. So, am I arguing for more neoliberalism at Yale?
No.
No.
But you are arguing for these alternative spaces. You are arguing clearly for not
Which our
just thinking
classrooms
about
can be.
the academy versus the public square, but instead, which we saw, of course, in Occupy, all these study groups. And, when you're sitting in a tent in the middle of Wall Street, you have nothing but time on your hands, especially if your phone can't be charged. So you want texts. And a lot of that happened.
Right, we've been reading Moten and Harney's Undercommons and thinking about how to have spaces inside of this beast to do that.
The only thing I would add to your beautifully said question is we haven't begun to test these institutions to see what they can do.
Yes,
That the people in them liked these wood walls. I've gotten involved in a lot of building projects now. These are shitty walls. They can be very quickly destroyed. What looks solid was sometimes made with great care and foresight.
But she's not telling you to destroy the walls.
No, well, insofar as it's a part of creating new spaces, I'm always interested. And students have a different power than faculty, financially, prospectively, imposing certain weaknesses back to them. And I have certainly found at this institution, which I did not imagine being at, the extent to which claims of strength, this is as it was, any research shows, was a very recent past, a conjure. And the greatness of an intellectual before, about a 30-year history. You look at the scholarly record of scholars at Yale in the 1960s, embarrassing. And yet we are the place that incarnates and protects excellence. I know why. I can tell the history of why we do that and why we think we do relative to a 300-year history, but it's because you've been in it. Not because we've necessarily found a way. And we've been able to allure a lot of views into it because of wood walls that can quickly be resurfaced, changed with a little bit of, and then a little bit of resistance back from us, because we have to stay here afterwards and clean up and put the seats back together and create the classroom again. So we have to perform our role as strategists and protectors, and you have to perform your role as tactician and resistor, and please let that not stop. And the extent to which faculty have been a little dull on the job because the pleasures are so great, intellectual and material, to being able to think full time. We are complicit in not seeing that we too could do a little more to say, we decide who gets tenure every day. And that can change.
Maybe we want, how long does this run? Where's Gary? Do we want more
He
questions?
left.
Oh, Nika.
Why
you have a
don't we
question.
take
Go
these
ahead.
last two questions together? Not at the same time, but one at a time, and then we'll wrap up. So, yeah.
First, I want to say this is crazy because I thought there were few merits left to being here, and then I found the poster for this conversation, and I was like, this is something I want to be at. I really appreciate the conversation that was just had, but I have to confess that it does make me uncomfortable because 2 years ago when I got here, I would have wanted to create that alternative space at the university. I would have wanted to transform every single classroom space into that, into its revolutionary potential. And I have to confess that that because I spent time in an Occupy tent, not
on Wall Street, but a space where people took time out of the place that other people were excluded from to be in front of a building and then sit and let people that they had never met before, who they don't know where they sleep, just interrupt them in conversation about their politicization of the future. I know who is missing in our classrooms. Like, there are people that are just not there. And for us to sit in classrooms and think that we can engage with these texts in a way that is responsible with consenting to the systematic exclusion of certain people, as much as I am devoted, and I respect all three of you so much for this devotion to careful intellectualism, believing that there is a shit that was not sought, that we did leave behind. I'm constantly just thinking about the people who are not there. And so when I think about the call that my grandmother makes about like whether I will go to grad school, and when I'm thinking about my 12-year-old brother and how when he wants to go to undergrad, the world will not be normal. I'm just thinking like, can we wait? I don't know a single revolutionary that decided to do what they did because they felt ready.
We'll leave that to Professor Brown.
No, we're going to take both questions.
Okay, sorry.
No, thank you for that question, comment, because I think it kind of fits in really well to the question that I left thinking last night, and it's very present in the discussion today. But I left last night thinking about the role that the expert plays in knowledge, especially the concept of expert or expertise, as the owners, the people who get to claim ownership of this knowledge, of this position in politics, of like, how do we reconcile this creation of expertise when it so very much frames itself, especially in the university, as like, we are the thinkers, we are the possessors of knowledge. And how does that play with information, when a lot of the ways in which we gain access is not necessarily proving that we have knowledge, but rather that we were able to retain enough information to pass the SAT, to pass the GREs, so both the role of the expert and knowing that the institutionalization, the professionalization of the ownership of knowledge, and it's completely complicit and affected by the oppression and exclusion of non-experts. And we see this in social justice as well, of like lay people becoming citizen scientists, because scientists are the ones who get to create knowledge. But what does the citizen science, or the amateur, which is something maybe even better than the citizen, because citizen reflects like there are people who are doing this work who are not citizens, rejecting the legal term in expert and using amateur instead. Yeah, just something more of to think about, but really that role in all of this. Thank you. Yeah.
I would just say one thing to begin. My nerdiness is grounded in a thing that has very little to do with what I teach. I love sectarianism. I love really obscure conflicts over when you put the baby's head in the water all day long. I want to do that all day long.
She doesn't want to put the baby's head
I will
in
actually.
It was just one of those grammatical.
Well, she might. She might.
But insofar as that tradition of obsessiveness has given me the right to then say this, I then join the question of expertise. What pleasure does that give? So I'm about to say something. I imagine it might be soothing or not to you, but in my own mind it's very soothing. But it is based on the question that deep learning, all of a sudden you come into these, everyone in this room has had this. Oh my God, if everyone knew that, they'd feel a little less what? History of religions is filled with basically one thing: don't forget the dead. Don't forget the dead. Don't forget the dead. That's the thing that links every form of tradition, whatever, polytheism, monotheism, whatever. Don't forget the missing. Now, the missing is different than the dead, but I think for me, the powerful presence of a socially engineered classroom which puts you in it. This was by design you are here. It's only a 10-year-old history at Yale that we designed you to be here. Was not so that you forgot, although let's be clear, the 20th century history of this institution was absolutely assimilate. You're a Jew, you're a Catholic, become us. Being a WASP is amazing. We have such fun on Block Island. You don't want to be that person. And we now socially engineered a world of students who are like, I don't want your conversion. I want to be me. And I want to remember everyone who doesn't get a piece of this. Right. I think there are traditions of knowledge and thought that have also told you, don't forget, ritualize their remembrance. How do you do that? We can have some talks. And I think expertise gives us a resource. But let's be clear, expertise is always a posture in the room that everyone's like, give me a break. And every time Kevin Cruz is along thread correcting the historicity of legislators, I feel a little embarrassed. Because I think they don't care, Kevin. They don't care. But then we value expertise. Why? I think because we know that somewhere someone is tracking all the humanity that is lost and forgotten. To what end? I then lead to the philosophers.
I'm going to say something simpler.
Please.
While respecting that you got it right. You absolutely got it right. I think that the difficulty of a developed political consciousness while one is inside the academy is that it chafes, not just against the wrongs of the way the academy is organized, but the very idea of continuing to be here when there is a world to save. And I don't know that this is going to be soothing in the least, because chafing is very uncomfortable. But I think that it's probably worth it to live with that, including the I'm here, but my sisters and brothers aren't. I'm here, but there's a world excluded. I'm here, but it demands assimilation. Being a WASP is great. I'm here, but I know the deep corruptions of this institution manifest at the law school meltdown last year. I'm here, but I need to be out where the world is. Maybe it helps to think about Ocasio-Cortez, who is a shining light for us right now because she got an education. She also happens to have spirit and verve and God and charisma and guts. But that analytic thing she's got going could not have involved a short-circuiting of these kinds of moments where you put it all together, or the moments of, I'm not saying it was a perfect education, I'm not saying that this is a defensive education, but I do think that what one can get from thinking, maybe I'll just end that there. And then I'll say this. A part of me continues to chafe and lunge toward the world, and as I approach retirement, which I'm going to do next year, I am still undecided about whether I'm going to continue to have a relationship at all with the academy, or whether I'm going to try to take this voice and put it directly into political movements and political agitation, because there's a world at stake, and I feel like I've had a really good ride, and what I want to make sure is that I give back everything I can. Now, I'll tell you what's interesting. Whenever I try that out, including with my students, say, oh, no, we need you in the classroom. Oh, no, we need you in the academy. This is where you wake people up. And I think that tension, and I'm not saying this is about, me in particular. I'm saying that tension of what happens inside educational institutions at their best, if we can think properly about how to reorganize them, how to press against their limitations, how to deal with that problem of expertise, which we both want about certain things, and reject about certain things. And that, too, is a tension. I mean, the educational system is broken, but that doesn't mean it's just about getting rid of the experts. Just as the medical system is broken and we all rely on it and try to find our ways to the experts, I think that with The economists are really interesting to me right now because they're the experts of experts of experts, and only a tiny number of them are willing to say oops about what they brought us to over the last 30 years. But that tiny group is interesting because their oops rarely involves humility about the field or about the knowledge. It's just, oh, we went a little too far with the free market thing and we didn't really think about the political implications, and oops, we really didn't realize it might generate plutocracy rather than pure competitive markets, and that it would produce such extreme inequality. Oh, Piketty told us about that, but now we realize we didn't. But still, what you need to do is listen to us because we've learned our lessons. We'll get the next phase right. They need that oops to be deep, really deep. On the other hand, we look at the climate scientists and we live off of every drop of what they deliver to us in their knowledge about interconnected systems that have been parceled out to biology, chemistry, physics, oceanography, et cetera, because the climate scientists are the ones who understand those things are all connected. We want that expertise. So even there, I think we bear attention that requires us, as we think about building different kinds of universities, or pressing against the university altogether to demand something, or to deal with, to be more politically efficacious in the world. Even there, I think we have to be careful about not simply putting things in categories of wrong and right. We want to transform expertise. We want to build humility into it, and we want it to leave its conventional categories and safe spaces. We want it to go into a worldliness and an encounter with its limitations. And that, that's what's happened at its best in the medical field, as it finally understood that psyche and soma are connected, as it finally understood that acupuncture is not just, some mad traditional pre-scientific thing, but actually does everything from relieve pain to produce sleep to soothe things that no other form of medical approach can engage. That humility in expertise and that knowledge, that reckoning that we need to continue to develop knowledge in order to be efficacious politically, that's where we need conjoining, not new forms of opposition. Enough. I think we're overdue for coffee and
Shall
dessert.
we thank Professor Brown for everything
Thank
she's
you for,
given us?
oh, no.
Oh.
No? Oh. Sorry, I'm sorry. I was looking at that clock and I thought, yeah.
But you're not letting us run the show.
He's not letting us end the show.
He wants the show to go
We're
on.
still on the clock.
All right.
Yeah, this question may take too much of an answer, I don't know, and excuse me for writing it out, I just wanted to make sure I was succinct and clear. So I'd like to ask Professor Brown what she might say about Max Weber's ideas about Islam and the role that they might play, or that they do play in this Islamophobia of the present. Islamophobia is based, among other things, on the idea that the Islamic world can be defined as a self-contained civilization with essential inherent features that set it apart, essential features that are bad, that set it apart from other civilizations, and particularly that of the West, or at least that's one form of Orientalism.
Yes.
Many have argued that Max Weber played an important role in the development of such ideas. I will quote briefly from Armando Salvatore's book, Islam and the Political Discourse of Modernity. According to Max Weber, Islam lacked a concept of civilization in ethical dimensions. It could not produce the spiritual inwardness conducive to the mastery of the outer world in the form of capitalism, and this failure was linked to its character as a war religion. The way in which Weber's kind of thinking has been embodied in the intellectual history of the modern West is reflected in a crude remark by Claude Lévi-Strauss in Tristes Tropiques in 1955, and I quote, "Islam is a barrack room religion, appealing to anxious men who make up for feelings of inferiority by jealousy, pride, and heroism, the traditional forms of sublimation with which the Arab soul has always been associated?
Well, you're right. My response will be brief, and I suspect you might have something to say as well. Islam has probably been treated worse than the Jews in the history of modern political thought. By modern, I simply mean 18th century forward. It always gets identified, whether by John Stuart Mill or by Weber, Burke. I mean,
Franz Rosenzweig.
yeah, I was going to start with the
Jews.
the 20th century as this kind of tribalistic, hyper masculinist. It's the displacement of. It's everything Said said about Orientalism on steroids. It's the displacement of all that we imagine we have ejected from the West, that we do not have here onto this one space and place. And that intellectual contribution, I think, cannot be said to be causal in the current surge of Islamophobia, but certifying and legitimating of it without question. And I offer no defense of Weber in that regard, or in a larger sense, any defense of his treatment of religion more generally. I just can't. That's not the Weber I was reading for or reading. Now, does that also have a place and a play in the Weber that I am reading? The masculinism certainly does. The rationalism certainly does. The belief in our scientificity, all those, Enlightenment values minus the emancipatory promise certainly does. So that's where I severely part company with him. Did you want to add?
No,
You being a religion person?
I would only observe that the question of treating any community with delicacy and grace is a question that these universities are especially good at correcting and thinking forward on. And at this university, they're extraordinary contemporary scholars of Islam. The question of have they corrected what is so deep inside of us, which is to divide and to compare. I think what I found moving about Wendy's particular description today of encountering Weber, encountering a conservative other who she is not. And what would it be to take totally, deeply, passionately, seriously that person has the multiplicity, the contradiction of prejudice, racism, confusion that we possess, she possesses, and then to encounter fully. What does that look like? And what merits an other to do that? I think that's a moving depiction of what, at best, we hope to stage in these rooms.
I'm glad we made room for that last question. Thank you.
Me too.
Thank you. There is a light lunch served for everybody. Everybody's invited. It's in room 108, right down the hall, where you can continue the conversation. That's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing is, Wendy Brown, this has been an extraordinary 3 days. Thank you so very much. Thank all three of our speakers, but Wendy in particular. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And I also want to thank my host for inviting me, and to thank the two of you for really rare and wonderful conversation. These things don't always work, as we all know. We've all been in the ones that haven't worked.
Yes.
And this one did. And thank you for continuing to show up.